Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you. Our speaker is a familiar member of our church who has served as choir director, pianist, member of umpteen committees. She is a retired professor of humanities from Jacksonville University who retains a lively interest in biblical studies and the foundations of our cultural heritage. Her topic is the likely Easter story. Please welcome Sharon Scholl.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, you're saying, hey, isn't that the woman that demolished the Christmas story? What is she gonna do to Easter? Well, first I apologize for my laryngitis. It's just one of those things. The two stories do have some things in common. They were both written 60 to 80 years after the events they portray, and the writers did not know Jesus. They didn't know anyone who had known Jesus, and there were, of course, no eyewitnesses to either event. And both stories, they are written to interpret Jesus to the small group of people who wanted to picture him that way. Not, that as he was, but the way they needed him to be. And the Easter story, though, does have a framework of fact that is widely acknowledged. The writers know when Jesus died. They know how it happened. They know where it happened. And to some extent, this is really fudged. They know why it happened and who is responsible, although they didn't quite acknowledge that. But the details presented in the Gospels are either imaginary or they are adopted from other sources, particularly the Old Testament. And so you wonder now, how do we, 2,000 years later, presume that we know more accurately the real events of that time? Well, yeah, we have better sources, we have greater access to materials, we have better technology, and we have better communication systems that are free from the demands of established religion. Those are terrific advantages. And to be a bit more detailed, we know three important things. Through archaeology and sociology and economics and historians and all the rest, we know a great deal about small agrarian societies around the Mediterranean basin as they existed in Jesus' time. We know about their social divisions, their material cultures, economics, political structure, because they are much alike. So we have a really good sense of the kind of world that Jesus inhabited. And two, you would be absolutely drop-jawed imagined at the amount of materials, written materials on papyrus, on vellum, carved in stone, in tombstones or whatnot, that still exist in actual form. There they are from the ancient world. I mean, strange things like 300 letters that Cicero wrote to his friend Atticus, still there and still translated and readable. So we've just got so much more stuff than the ancient writers did. And finally, we have biblical resources by students, scholars who speak and read all those ancient languages, who can compare sources from surrounding cultures. And so with all of these things trained on it, we don't get the actual Easter story, but we do get the most likely Easter story. And where does it start? Well, let's start where the accounts in the New Testament start, with so-called Palm Sunday, which comes up in a few weeks. And this is the time at which, at least in the scriptures, Jesus' grand entrance into Jerusalem occurred, with massive greetings from the surrounding crowds, with palm trees stripped of leaves and put on the path in order to celebrate his passage on a donkey. And, it was quite a ceremonial entrance. But picture it really. We've had a very small group of Galileans who walked from Galilee to Jerusalem, depending upon the charity of people along the way, of towns, etc. Couldn't have been more than about 15 of them that could do that. And also, the Jerusalem folks didn't know anything about Jesus. If this had been John the Baptist, he might have gotten that celebration. But Jesus, no. They would have hardly made a dent in the massive crowd that gathered for, we don't know, it's either Passover or the High Holy Days in the fall. But they would not have made a dent in that huge crowd. And certainly, if they had spoken to anyone, their accent would have revealed them as Galileans, the backwoods of Jesus' culture. They were not looked on well. And only the wealthy merchant or the high Roman official would have ridden a donkey. And so, you just realize that there were no blaring trumpets, no palm branches strewn on the road likely. They pushed their way into Jerusalem with the massive horde that was there. Well, around midweek, Jesus made his way to the Temple Mount, which was an enormous area. The temple took up a tiny piece because people didn't go in the temple like we are here. Only the priests went in the temple, so it didn't need to be big. But the Temple Mount was just swarming with people. And among them were money changers that were exchanging the tainted money of the outside for the pure money that was used to buy the animal sacrifice that you needed to up your presence with God. And he was horrified at the abundant commercialism of that particular scene and started turning over tables and driving their occupants out. Now, this was swarming not only with people, but with Roman soldiers who were there to keep the peace and to keep what Jesus was doing from happening. And so, of course, he was immediately grabbed and run off to jail. There was a gospel account of that nice garden scene where the soldiers quietly arrest Jesus. Not likely. If they had actually found all of his followers gathered in one group, they'd have slammed the whole bunch into prison. And actually, Mark admits that during the fracas at the temple, Jesus' followers scattered, ran for their lives. They saw what was coming. So what does this mean? None of Jesus' followers actually witnessed the events that followed. So where did all those details come from? The trial before Pilate, the crucifixion, the burial, the empty tomb. What about all that? Well, everyone had seen crucifixion, so that was easy to describe. But the details of this particular crucifixion were borrowed from the Old Testament sources and transformed into Jesus' situation by calling them prophecies which were being fulfilled. For instance, the detail about the soldiers gambling for Jesus' clothing came from Psalm 22, which said, "They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." Well, the detail about his being offered some pain-deadening during the crucifixion came from Psalm 69, which says, "They gave me a pain and poison for food and vinegar to drink." So all those details are there because they were found somewhere else. There was no trial. Only Roman citizens got trials, and Jesus was not. He was a captive colonist who was owed absolutely nothing. And there was no merciful Pontius Pilate who really tried to let Jesus off. He has gone down in history as particularly cruel. But by that time, the Gospels were written. It was terribly important to portray people who followed Jesus as loyal Roman citizens because there were limited persecutions of Christians going on for several hundred years, and this was a way to avoid persecution, was to, claim the Romans were all good people. And so, unfortunately, they did it by blaming the Jews that had not accepted Jesus as the Messiah for what happened to Jesus. And we have suffered from that ever since. There was no need for any Jewish legislative body to meet and decide anything about Jesus' fate. Romans just ordinarily, routinely crucified anyone who disturbed the peace. That was not necessary to decide anything about him. And they certainly had Jesus dead to rights on that one. So there it went. Well, artists have portrayed the crucifixion, and despite, our image that we get of it, we always see Jesus' mother, several mourners, even the deceased John the Baptist is portrayed standing behind the cross as though it were a kind of ceremonial gathering. But even the Gospel of Mark admits that the viewers of a crucifixion had to stand far away. So if there were any Jesus' last words that we celebrate today, they weren't heard by anybody. And they were thought up about a century after Jesus' death by quotations from our old friend, the Psalms. So one element of this grisly death that caused the gospel writers the most evasive effort was the body disposal problem. Romans and their laws intended to inflict humiliation as well as pain upon the crucifixion by denying the victims' burial. They left them on the crosses to be devoured by carrion birds and wild dogs. And perhaps if the family of the crucified had enough political power and enough bribery money, they might buy the body for burial. But the Romans didn't crucify those people. And Jesus' followers certainly had nothing of that. One of the earliest sources, because there are many sources besides those we have in the scriptures, there are at least 12 accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, all very different. And some of them claim that the people who killed Jesus buried him. And that was the second possibility. They could take the bodies off the crosses and put them all in a pile to make them a little more convenient, I suspect, for the animals. Well, no tomb, no resurrection story. And the first portrayal of a living Jesus was actually by Paul the Apostle, who saw Jesus in a vision. He did not see him resurrected. And he made a point of saying that flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. So that was the first vision, the first resurrection portrayal that we have. But that just wasn't enough for subsequent writers who kept getting more and more physical detail on it. And by the beginning of the 2nd century, the Gospel of John, we have a resurrected Jesus in the flesh, and we have an invented character, Doubting Thomas, that actually puts his hands onto the wounds. So it went from one to the other. Well, we know what happens when all of these passionate movements, when they experience some catastrophic failure. The participants slink back home and try to claim no part in what happened. Ooh, I drove people to the riot, but I went to the movies. Yeah, but that didn't happen with Jesus' followers. He had taught them what life could be. He had lived it with them, and they could live it without him. And that, I think, was the real resurrection. That is what made us in history what we have been. So until the literary excess that we call the Easter story sort of filled it up, beneath all that is this unflinching reality. It's the story of the good news that was written that is a much better news about a man who came from the lowest level of his society, but was a spiritual genius, whose belief in the possibility of a society became a permanent legacy that guides every victory for personal freedom and the inherent dignity of all people. He didn't just teach it, he lived it. The parables that he engaged listeners with in a struggle to determine the values that were vital to our collective lives. His meals were eaten with an assembly of the poor, the wealthy, the outcast, the influential. He expressed his contempt for the stratified society of his time. He fought for and taught an unbrokered religion where there was no priest between us and our God. He was a walking offense to the purity code that was the rule of his society. He was a part of his time, but he is also a part of the future of humanity, showing us the kind of life we must adopt if an anticipated 10 billion of us are going to survive on this planet. That's the best Easter story. And someday our species may be worthy of it. Blessed be.